la adquisición de activos de empresas es una parte muy pequeña de nuestro programa de adquisición de activos. Nosotros queremos reducir el retorno o la penalización de estos bonos para que sean más atractivos, que están denominados en euros, lo que es muy positivo. Y nosotros vamos a ver cómo podemos tener en cuenta el imperativo de la lucha contra el cambio climático y la preservación de la biodiversidad dentro de nuestras acciones. En cuanto al banco malo, he tomado nota de lo que ha dicho nuestro amigo griego, pero no hay una posición del Banco Central Europeo y no, lo consideramos prematuro ahora en medio de la pandemia. En cuanto a las medidas presupuestarias, yo lo que veo es que las nuevas propuestas de la Comisión Europea contienen un volumen suficiente de subvenciones frente a los préstamos, y por eso no entiendo que usted diga que cada vez hay más préstamos y menos subvenciones. No en las propuestas que yo he visto. La proporción de subvenciones es superior, pero no basta esta dicotomía, esta contraposición de préstamos y subvenciones. No. La eficacia de la respuesta dependerá de que los países más afectados puedan acceder a estos fondos que tanto necesitan, de preferencia en forma de subvenciones, sobre todo para los países más afectados. Tiene que llegar la financiación a los más afectados rápidamente, y yo sé que el Parlamento Europeo desempeñará su papel y espero que los Estados miembros sean conscientes de lo urgente que es este asunto. En cuanto a la adquisición en mercados secundarios de bonos emitidos por la Comisión Europea, independientemente de la agencia a la que recurra la Comisión, o incluso si lo hiciera ella misma, como lo ha hecho con el IFSM, desde luego que el Banco Central Europeo puede adquirir en los mercados secundarios. Sería una posibilidad. Yo lo que espero es que el instrumento europeo sea tan atractivo que haya compradores privados para hacerlo, creando así una nueva categoría de nuevos bonos en el futuro. Muchas gracias, y pienso que he podido responder a todas sus preguntas. Muchas gracias. Hemos respetado muy bien el tiempo para el siguiente punto en nuestro orden del día. Tenemos una audiencia pública sobre la Junta Europea de Riesgo Sistémico, y doy de nuevo la bienvenida a la señora Lagarde, que comparece ahora en su capacidad de presidente de la Junta Europea de Riesgo Sistémico. Es, de hecho, la primera vez que lo hace aquí en la Comisión de Asuntos Económicos y Monetarios, y por eso me alegro por sondear a la señora Lagarde. Nosotros la apoyamos. Es una prioridad el riesgo sistémico con los tiempos que corren, y de hecho ha habido recomendaciones de la Junta Europea vinculado con la crisis, y hubo también una sesión de información. Y entonces, de acuerdo con las buenas prácticas, vamos a actuar de la siguiente manera. La señora Lagarde dispone de un cuarto de hora para su introducción, y después va a haber plazas de 5 minutos de preguntas y respuestas. Pero antes de empezar, no va a haber interpretación para esta parte de esta reunión, porque de momento solo disponemos de 2 horas de interpretación por las circunstancias actuales. Por eso yo invito a que todos hagan sus intervenciones en inglés. Muchísimas gracias, dice la presidenta. Y ahora paso la palabra a la presidenta Lagarde. Acabo aquí el servicio de interpretación.
Madam Chair, to appear before this committee for the first time in my capacity as chair of the European Systemic Risk Board. The ESRB has always had a strong relationship with this committee. You played a crucial role in establishing the ESRB in 2010, and you have drawn its attention to many important issues, including the impact of climate change and the role of the international financial reporting standards for financial stability. You have also greatly contributed to the strengthening of the institutional framework of the ESRB, which took effect at the end of last year. And as part of this process, we are delighted to have implemented enhanced accountability and transparency measures. It is important that the ESRB clearly explains its actions to the European citizens, to the legislators, and to the financial sector, particularly in these difficult times. This brings me to the main topic of my opening remarks. I would like to explain how the ESRB has responded to the specific challenges posed by the coronavirus pandemic. There is no doubt that we have been confronted with a crisis the likes of which we have never seen in peacetime. All parts of Europe are affected and challenged. And this time the shock does not come from the financial system. It is a devastating health emergency that threatens people's lives, the business in which they work, the economy as a whole, and therefore also the financial system. Moreover, in a crisis of such scale, to prevent an even sharper loss of capacity and jobs in the economy, we need to ensure that the financial sector continues providing its vital services to firms and households. In other words, while the financial sector is not immune to the shock, it needs to be able to help absorb it rather than amplify it. So let me briefly discuss the risks to financial stability that we are concerned about and identify for you some of the remedies or beginning of response that have been provided by a very, in my view, efficient and expedited working process that we have put in place in special response to the crisis. First, this severe economic shock could trigger widespread defaults in the real economy, especially among firms and households which were already over-indebted. While measures taken by governments and at the EU level can help to mitigate the negative impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the real economy, the depth of the recession calls for the developments in this area to be closely monitored. Second, despite a recent rebound in asset prices, there are still risks related to high volatility in financial markets, given the substantial degree of uncertainty about the path the recovery will take. Third, as a result of the support measures taken by governments and the reduction in economic activity, concerns about government debt levels may re-emerge. And fourth, the difficult macroeconomic environment I just described poses significant challenges to financial institutions. Now, obviously, all the risks I have just mentioned will be aggravated if we were to face a second wave of the pandemic. So the ESRB has responded to this emergency with a set of actions in 5 areas. The first area is linked to the concerns about widespread defaults in the real economy. First and foremost, it is important that the real economy receives all the liquidity support it needs. At the same time, we need to take into account all the intended and unintended implications of the fiscal measures on the financial system. For example, measures implemented in one country may have positive or negative spillover effects on other countries. It is therefore important that macroprudential authorities monitor the implications of support measures at the national level, and that the ESRB in particular looks into any cross-sector and cross-border issues that may arise as a result. I'm glad to tell you that the ESRB is today publishing a recommendation that establishes minimum requirements for the national monitoring of such measures by macroprudential authorities and creates a framework for reporting to the ESRB. The second area focuses on the concerns about market liquidity. The sharp drop in asset prices that occurred at the onset of the coronavirus pandemic was accompanied by significant redemptions from some investment funds and a deterioration in financial market liquidity. Investment funds with significant exposures to corporate debt and real estate assets were particularly affected. In that context, the ESRB adopted a recommendation addressed to the European Securities and Markets Authorities, the ESMA, that it coordinate with the national competent authorities on focused supervisory engagement with the two corresponding sectors of investment funds, corporate debt and real estate assets. This will provide a better understanding of how well these funds are prepared for the conditions that I just described and help to determine steps that could be taken to enhance their preparedness. In the same vein, the ESRB asked the European Insurance and Occupational Pensions Authority, EIOPA, to promptly finalize the liquidity monitoring framework for insurers, which EIOPA and its members had already begun preparing as a response to the COVID-19 crisis. The third area concerns the potential wave of credit rating downgrades in the corporate bonds sector and the fire sales this might cause. From a macroprudential perspective, it is important to ensure that the implications of these credit ratings downgrades be well understood and do not impair the functioning of financial markets. To this end, the ESRB, together with its member institutions, continue to monitor the developments in this regard across the financial system. The fourth area is linked to the concern that losses in the real economy will impair the functioning of the financial system precisely when its role of providing credit is most vital. There is therefore a need to boost financial institutions' resilience. This can be achieved by restricting distributions, for instance, dividend payments, share buybacks, variable remuneration, in vital sectors of the financial system. From a market perspective, restrictions of this nature can also help to remove the potential stigma attached to financial institutions that decide to preserve their capital resources in these times of crisis. The ESRB believes that a uniform approach is needed across the crucial segments of the financial sector and across the EU. This is why it is today issuing a recommendation on the restriction of distributions during the COVID-19 pandemic. This recommendation covers banks, certain investment firms, insurers, reinsurers, and central counterparties, and envisages distributions being restricted until January 2021. Furthermore, the recommendation outlines guiding principles on payout restrictions within cross-border groups. As demonstrated in some instances during the previous crisis, flight to safety or a home bias might transform into a collective action problem. If all financial institutions withdraw their resources from host countries that are dominated by subsidiaries of cross-border financial institutions, local lending will be undermined. While the current crisis should not serve as a reason to suspend the rules of the single market principle of free movement of capital, there may be grounds for asking financial institutions and relevant authorities to carefully monitor developments in the financial sector and the real economy in both home and host countries, and factor these developments into their decisions. The recommendation, therefore, advocates that home and host authorities maintain a close dialogue. With this recommendation, the ESRB is supporting and complementing initiatives from the European Central Bank, from the European banking authorities, from EIOPA, and from national authorities. The fifth area focuses on the liquidity risks arising from margin calls. COVID-19 pandemic has caused a sharp drop in asset prices and has increased volatility, resulting in large margin calls across both centrally cleared and non-centrally cleared markets. While the system was able to withstand these conditions, it is important to enhance its resilience for potential future periods of stress. Margin calls could increase further due to potential credit rating downgrades, which I have already discussed, and possible further market volatility. Such conditions could have negative implications for the liquidity management of market participants, such as clearing members and their clients for their funding needs, and possibly even for their solvency if the liquidity stress leads to systematic fire sales of assets. Therefore, the ESRB is today publishing a recommendation aimed at limiting cliff effects in relation to the demand for collateral in centrally and non-centrally cleared markets, enhancing central counterparty liquidity management, and reducing liquidity constraints relative to margin collection. Moreover, with this recommendation, the ESRB intends to promote international standards related to the mitigation of pro-cyclicality in the provision of client clearing services and in securities financing transactions. Now, while preparing our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have not lost sight of our medium-term priorities. And I'm very glad to announce that today, the ESRB is also publishing a report on financial stability risks related to climate change. The pandemic has made us all aware of the need to ensure our financial systems are resilient when faced with large shocks that affect not only our economies, but also our well-being more generally. The costs associated with climate change appear inevitable, yet the financial markets are not fully pricing in this risk. One major impediment is linked to climate-related disclosures, which remain insufficient, incomplete, and inconsistent. The European Commission's ongoing consultation is very timely and welcome here. In the meantime, we have also been looking into the exposures of European financial institutions to climate-related risks based on the currently available information we have managed to collect. These exposures appear to be limited on average, but concentrated exposures in a few sectors and firms could give rise to systemic risk. The ESRB and its member institutions are continuing their work in this area, notably on constructing forward-looking scenarios, and I'm sure that we will come back to this topic during our future meetings. Thank you very much, and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we open our Q&A session, and we start with Danuta Hübner from EPP.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, Madam President. I would like, as a former rapporteur for EMIR 2, I would like to ask you a question related to the market infrastructure and specifically to the CCPs, the central counterparties, because I think they are all systemic by nature and they must have sufficient liquidity to remain sound and to remain also able to absorb losses, which hopefully would never be needed. And there is this recommendation coming from ESRB that is referring to what you mentioned also, which is this liquidity arising from margin calls or margin collections, that actually these recommendations, they aim at ensuring that margin collection is not excessively limiting liquidity and putting the members and clients in worse situation and also even producing the pro-cyclical effect. So there is this issue here that a measure which is designed actually to ensure stability can in reality also provoke instability. So I would like to get from you as much as you can just sort of assurances that the recommendations allow for good balancing of this liquidity related and margin calls related risk. And in this context also, because we know that among the clients and members, we have not only big banks that have no problem with pooling liquidity, but there are also non-bank members and non-bank clients, and their access, their capacity to pool liquidity is much more limited, and they are much more vulnerable. So I would like to have your assessment whether this sort of lack of differentiation, because I couldn't find the differentiation between those two types of clients and members in the recommendation, whether you see there is no risk. And the second question, very shortly, the cyber threats, cyber crime, cyber risk, because we all read that there has been more now cases during the pandemic of those cyber attacks. And in the recommendation, there are also issues related to the need of exchanging more information on cybersecurity threats and to use best practices. And my question here is actually on those best practices. Do you think we have them? They exist? There is enough of them? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your very technical questions. I will start with your second question concerning the cyber attack risk. I think that the cyber attack risk is something that is highly relevant, on which we clearly have had an assessment and an exchange of best practices. And I'm not sure that we actually have identified those best practices. But clearly the ESRB serves as a conduit to best practices. And it is clearly also something that the ESRB will continue to push. I'll share with you from previous life experience that it is often difficult actually to have multiple participants, and as you know, we have 70 members on the ESRB, but to have them actually be prepared to open up and to share best practices with others. I believe that the forum that the ESRB constitutes and the confidentiality of the discussions that we have had, including on many difficult topics, will be conducive to this, to the identification of best practices. It is clearly an important source of systemic risks to the financial system, which could have negative consequences to the real economy. We know from the work and the exchange of information in the ESRB that there has been more of those cyber attacks, that they have increased in sophistications, but at least so far, the determination by the ESRB is that it has not reached a systemic level at this point in time. But, it's not something that I would want to bet on, and it's one that we have to guard against because it would clearly have major consequences. Turning now to the your point about the CCPs and liquidity. In the recommendation that has been put together by the task force focusing on this particular item, the recommendation really aims to ensure that the necessary measures that market participants, including the central counterparties, are taking to self-protect during periods of high market volatilities are not creating undue liquidity stress at clearing members and their clients. And that includes mitigating procyclicality in relation to the demand for collateral, also including client clearing services and in bilateral markets. Enhancing central counterparty stress test scenario for the assessment of liquidity needs, and limiting excessive liquidity constraints related to margin collection. So I think that, that particular recommendation, which was, if I remember, proposed by the task force led by the Banque de France, namely Emmanuel Assoin, was regarded by the advisory committee and the academic committee as highly technical, very deep into the technicalities of the functioning of CCPs. And clearly it was regarded unanimously as beneficial and supportive of addressing the risks that result from CCPs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now Pedro Marques from SND.
Thank you so much, Madam President. Madam President of the ECB, I thank you for your intervention and President of the European Systemic Risk Board. And I have three questions addressing your intervention. First, about the risks that you referred to, that eventual defaults at the real economy and at the households could pose to financial stability. And you referred to the measures adopted by public authorities. And some of them are, as you know, the guarantees that were given to credit lines, for instance. And this means that these risks to financial stability are also risks to the stability of public debts, and that, as we know, is linked together in a loop that some call the doom loop. And I would like to know from you at this moment, what measures do you think should be adopted to diminish either both in the short term and in a strategic point of view to address this loop between public debts and financial stability and stability of financial sector. Second, about dividends and the capital buyback. You have referred to the issuance of the recommendation. Thank you for that, and the positions by the European Systemic Risk Board and other European institutions on this issue. I would say that it's not just a matter of promoting financial stability to go in this direction of not distribution of dividends. It's also about I would say to maintain citizen support to all the measures that we have taken and that we might have to take if we have significant problems in any financial institutions in the near term. So I would ask you, aside from these recommendations that have been issued, what, from your point of view, what should be, what kind of changes should we do eventually, even in legal provisions, so that in these kind of circumstances, in these extraordinary circumstances like this of the COVID crisis, so that this payouts, so that dividends or capital buybacks should not be allowed at all, and we should not be only relying on recommendations. Finally, going back again to the doom loop, we must recall the fact that the banking union is still incomplete. We do lack the third pillar. We have talked about that so many times, but decisions are to be taken, are to be made. What do you think? How important would it be, in your opinion, to have concrete and rapid steps in the direction of completing the banking union, particularly the third pillar, now and not in 2 or 3 years from now? How important would it be in your opinion, if we could complete the banking union by creating EDIs or starting to create EDIs rapidly before any consequences to
Excuse me, Chair, we're at 3 minutes already.
Might come from this crisis and its consequences on the real economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your three questions. On your first one, you're referring to one of the various work that has been put together and by one of the task force that really is intended to incentivize monitoring of the indirect effects of some of the measures that are decided. So one of the potential risk going forward is, as you said, the risk of default, the risk of impairment, the risk that whether at corporate level or at households level, the difficulty caused by the COVID-19 put those institutions, those corporations, those families into a difficult position. Faced with that risk, we certainly welcome the measures that have been decided by member states, and hopefully the intended consequences of these measures need to be achieved. The uptake of these measures will be key, and they should be directed at viable and productive sectors of the economy. At the same time, we also recognized in the ESRB that there can be unintended consequences as a result of those measures. First, measures from one country may have positive or negative spillover effects on other countries. Second, and related to the first point, while these measures target the non-financial sector, they also have implications for financial stability. And that is really why the dialogue between the authorities, including between national fiscal and macroprudential authorities, is so important. I highlighted this in a letter that I sent to the President and to members of the Economic and Financial Affairs Council. Furthermore, monitoring at the national and the European level is important. The ESRB can enhance what is being done at the national level by looking at cross-country and cross-sector issues that might arise and foster exchange of information and experiences. And to this end, the ESRB, in the recommendation to national authorities to monitor financial stability implication of COVID-19, related support measures, and to report to the ESRB, asks national macroprudential authorities to establish monitoring frameworks according to some minimum requirements and to report back to the ESRB. The recommendation also asks national macroprudential authorities to use existing information to the largest degree possible and to monitor the features and uptake of measures and their implications for financial stability. For example, through the flow of credit to the real economy, and to report relevant information to the ESRB. Turning now to your second question, that dealt with dividends, buyback, variable remuneration. The recommendation supports and complements earlier recommendations and a statement by the ECB, the EBA, and the EIOPA on payout restrictions, as well as related recent decisions made by many national authorities. As the pandemic is likely to last longer than anticipated, the timeline for restrictions is longer than that communicated by the ECB or by various other national authorities. Our recommendation, as you will have noted by my opening remarks, extends until the end of 2020, as opposed to many other national or other recommendations that were intended until the autumn of 2020. The recommendation supports actually a level playing field by applying the same restrictions, not only to banks, for instance, but across the whole spectrum. It does not cover the entire financial sector because of proportionality. For instance, it does not cover investment funds because of the specificities of their business model. Unlike banks and insurers that deal with clients on a principal basis, asset managers invest money as agents on behalf of clients whose assets are ring-fenced. This means that investment losses are borne by the clients who do not have recourse to the capital of the asset manager, except in case of gross negligence or fraud. The recommendation also identifies some principles for the cross-border implications, including home-host issues. And these principles focus on support for the smooth functioning of the internal markets, avoiding disproportionate adverse effects on the financial system in other member states and in the EU, and close cooperation of relevant authorities with each other and with the relevant resolution authorities. We have made a recommendation that is based on existing legislation, and we certainly do not recommend new powers to restrict distributions. On banking union, the ESRB did not focus specifically and did not identify exactly all the items that were needed in order to complete banking union. But, you know, it is the tradition of the ESRB to be very supportive of banking union, and all the attributes, all the elements that we all know are missing should clearly be the focus, and now is definitely the appropriate time to actually push and support for this completion of banking union. As we discussed earlier on in my previous capacity and in my previous hearing, the necessity to complete the capital market union as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we move to the next speaker, let me remind you, please stay within the 2 minutes and try to keep it to one question, otherwise we will not make it. Billy Kelleher, Renew.
Merci. President Lagarde, just one very straightforward question. In terms of the recommendations that the ESRB have made around debt moratoria, loan guarantees, subsidised loans, equity participation, and the monitoring of that in terms of the beneficiaries, the eligibility conditions, and all that flows from the different schemes put in place by various member states to address the challenges economically for COVID-19. And on top of that, you have the relaxation of the Stability and Growth Pact obligations of member states. You also have the relaxing of state aid rules. So coupled with that, would you have any concerns that you could, in effect, have rapid flows of capital from weaker economies, economies that are struggling, both because of COVID-19, but because they were already in very challenging economic circumstances, and their governments also having very heavy public debt? In other words, the doom loop, as was referred to previously, was not far away in some of those countries. So because some member states have budget surpluses, they have been able to unwind the state aid rules to invest in their economy. The Stability and Growth Pact is allowing more flexibility. Is that not a major challenge? And I suppose the question I have is, what can the ESRB do other than make recommendations and pronouncements to address what could become a very predatory policy by some member states over other member states in terms of flows of capital and investment from weaker economies to stronger economies? Thank you.
You know, clearly there have been multiple measures, extraordinary measures, taken by most authorities in order to respond to the extraordinary circumstances. And far from the ESRB, to consider that the escape clause, the relaxation to state aid, and the various moratorium measures, guarantee schemes, form of subsidies, one way or the other, would be detrimental. But it is clearly the duty of the ESRB, and I think that the task force that focused on that particular issue really delivered, to identify whether unintended consequences of these measures could actually have negative spillover effects across borders to other member states or across sectors and have a financial systemic dimension. And this is the work that the ESRB did. That's what it limited its consideration and its action on. And I would say that everybody has worked really hard, and the product of that work is as described in my remarks, as described in the recommendations that we are issuing, and in the letters that have been addressed. But to follow from in a way the previous hearing that we had, it really calls for improved and increased coordination between the various authorities. That's the reason why the monitoring device that was thought through and the recommendation of the monitoring framework to all authorities that was put together by the task force within the ESRB is a good process that we really encourage the member states to adopt in order to spot whatever indirect consequences there could be as a result of the necessary measures that they all took. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Stasis Yakeliunas from the Greens.
Thank you, Chair. Madame Lagarde, let me take you back to your introductory remarks and specifically on the issue of the cross-border issues in the financial stability risks. And based on the fact that some of the countries are still not in the Eurozone, and more specifically Sweden is not part of the Eurozone, and it has a number of parent banks that have subsidiaries in the Eurozone countries, in the three Baltic countries at least. That brings additionally some elements of risks. My question is your the board, the Systemic Risk Board, focusing on this specific area, and to what extent? I know that the colleges are established and they're working, and they've been learning from the experiences of the previous crisis. And actually, in this context, let me briefly refer to the fact that as of last week, on Thursday specifically, the Lithuanian Parliament approved and confirmed the financial crisis inquiry findings, which were started back in 2018. That's when the inquiry started. And some findings could be quite instrumental, I would hope so. And if you don't mind, I would refer them to you, sending to your institution, both in Systemic Risk Board and ECB and others, and then ask for the feedback maybe. And within this context of the host and home countries which are not in the same Eurozone establishment and safeguard network, would you think that the national Bank of Development, as a number of countries have, state-owned banks, and this bank, would you think that would improve the financial stability situation environment in some of the countries, and more specifically in the Baltic countries, as far as their dependence on the Swedish parent banks is concerned? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question. What I can assure you, as far as Sweden is concerned, is that its central bank governor, Governor Stefan Ingves, is playing a critical role as vice chair of the ESRB, and he's bringing to the plate is very long-term, in-depth experience of the indirect consequences of the contamination effects, and more importantly, of the home-host relationship that he has been himself exposed to significantly over the last 10 years. So certainly with his guidance and help, we are all very attached and very keen to encourage the pan-European dialogue, whether Sweden is or not part of the euro area. So that is a very active part of our discussion. And, I know from previous life as well, because I was finance minister during the financial crisis. I know how much the home-host relationship can be tense, can be prone to movements, and how it is absolutely indispensable to have a coordination, to have a dialogue between home and host, and to both have in mind the ultimate and so critical purpose of the single market, but also to make sure that we do not expose any country to the systemic risk that I have mentioned in my introductory remarks, that would result from multiple demands on a country which has many subsidiaries of banks that are sort of headquartered somewhere else. So we are pursuing this pan-European dialogue. We are really encouraging the home host country discussion We initially had hoped that there would be a special forum that would be set up in order to facilitate that dialogue. That we have not yet achieved, but I think that we've gone a long way, thanks in particular to the effort of the central bank governor of Sweden. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Robert Zille from ECR.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and welcome, President Lagarde, here in your first time in your capacity as a chair of ECRB. And my question exactly is going to your two positions, exactly in the issue which you are representing, chief person for a monetary policy in Eurozone, and also at the same time as evaluating the systemic risks. And we know that currently we have a divergence in stock indexes and real economy, and it raises many questions. So stock valuations are done by discounting cash flows, but even the biggest optimist does not expect that GDP to return to their pre-COVID-19 level within 2 years. And there also, since 2008, European Central Bank made every effort to increase inflation in the Eurozone. But in doing so, it's created so-called zombie companies, that would have already gone bankrupt without the ECB extremely low interest rates. And according to the recent study of the American National Bureau of Economic Research, the number of zombie companies rose from 4.5% to 6.7% between 2015 and 2016. And there could be some results of this, that each year inflation was 0.45% points lower than it would be if those cheap loans for companies need not to become available at all. So in other words, there is a money injected in the system with aim to create inflation, created deflation in real economies, but bubble became a part of a financial economy. And sitting on your two positions, do you see there is the coupling of this between the real economy and financial economy created problems? And so if the case, if ECB monetary policy maybe cause more harms than good for financial stability, does it not create systemic risk itself? So thank you very much.
The ESRB and its various task forces that volunteered to focus on key priorities have not addressed that particular point. I think they've not been short on work, and they have really focused on what were the key priorities. But as I mentioned previously, it is obviously part of our monetary policy to identify the effectiveness, the efficiency, and the proportionality of our measures. And the choices that we have made in either designing or calibrating or improving on previously existing monetary policy tools was driven by that three-pronged analysis. And it has led us to conclude that in response to the extraordinary circumstances, we had to take those measures, and we had to take monetary policy decisions that applied across the board to the entire euro area. Both in terms of stance, in terms of monetary policy transmission, in terms of easing of the tightened financial circumstances, we just had to take those measures.
Thank you very much. Now, Chris McManus from GUE.
Thank you, President Lagarde, and thank you for both your two presentations this afternoon, and as an MEP of only a matter of weeks, I found them
Mr. McManus, we've lost the connection. Mr. McManus, could you try the speak button again, please? Chair, it would seem that we cannot contact Mr. McManus.
Yes, okay. So while we wait to see if we can manage to connect, I have two requests for Catch the Eye questions, one from Pier Nicola Pedicini and the other one from Iro Einaluoma. I will give them 1 minute each for to collect their questions, and then I'll give the floor to Madame Lagarde for the answers. Thank you. Pedicini.
Chair, I don't see Mr. Pedicini in the room any longer.
Okay, then we'll move on to Iro Einaluoma.
Mr. Einaluoma, could you press the speak button, please? We don't appear to be... Mr. Einaluoma, could you speak, please? Could you press the speak button?
Do you hear me?
Yes, we see you and hear you now. Please go ahead.
Okay. So, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madam Lagarde, for your once more very elegant and evaluations and thoroughly thought evaluations. I still would like to continue the discussion on the dividends, because this is really an important thing for the financial institutions to be resilient, not to throw out money from banks and also insurance companies. And then there is also a moral point of view, because taxpayers are now looking very carefully what we are doing, and they have to make their share in this recovery process. Then the question is that if the money is going out from the banks as dividends, it will be problematic also from a moral point of view. And that's the reason that I'm still wondering, are the tools here the right ones? Because as you mentioned, it can be a problem if there are such kind of decisions and proposals which are not equal to all of the banks. So would it be suitable to have a little bit stronger tools here at our disposal to make it sure that that the suspension of dividends really is a matter of every financial institution? And I noticed that your predecessor, your successor in the IMF had the same kind of opinion, that we ought to be quite strict in the dividends question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for going back to this issue, which I think is really important. And for me, the real value and virtue of the ESRB recommendation is twofold. One, it is much broader in that it really encompasses multiple actors in the financial sector, not all of them, as I have responded earlier on to another question, but many of the players, number one. Number two, it reaches out all the way to the end of 2020, which I think is a good, it's a good and probably cautious approach to how long it is necessary for those firms to actually hold and keep their powder dry, if you will. I think the purpose of the measure is going to be different depending on the category of players. As far as the banks are concerned, it's going to restore or preserve or strengthen their capacity to lend. For the investment firms, it will improve their capacity to provide investment services, and for the insurers, it will help them play their role as long-term investor in corporate assets. But what is common to all of them is that it is going to hopefully help remove the stigma that is associated with the pronouncement of not paying dividends, or not paying variable remuneration, or not doing buyback of shares anymore. And I think that, what we heard in various forums, and the ESRB conducts those discussions, was on the part of the players themselves, the risks of the finger pointing, risk of the stigma associated, and the consequences that markets would draw from their decision to not pay dividends or to not buy back shares or to not pay variable remuneration. So in a way, issuing the recommendation gives them cover in order to be protected against this stigma risk that many of them have mentioned. Unfortunately, we can only give recommendations. The ESRB has no power to decide, and the IMF has absolutely no power to decide either. It is really peer pressure, moral suasion, a collective determination that can be most helpful in that respect. And we have observed that the level playing field across Europe, the fact that, for instance, the Bank of England went in the same direction, that the FSB was also taking a similar approach, all of that was certainly conducive to a better compliance with the recommendation, although the word compliance does not really work with the recommendation. You either follow the recommendation because you see wisdom about it, but we have seen many institutions, and the national central banks of the Euro system in particular, have played a critical role in exercising that moral suasion.
Thank you very much. I've been informed that Mr. McManus should be connected now.
Thank you, and I hope you can hear me. Thank you to President Lagarde, and thank you for your presentation. It was, as a new MEP, I found it both interesting and illuminating, and I want to welcome the strong ESRB recommendation of April the 2nd on dividend payments and other payouts during this crisis. I suppose I'm coming from maybe a moral position in that, to me, it's completely unjustifiable that when so many businesses are in distress that any company would be paying dividends. And I know that your mandate as President of the ECB and indeed of the ESRB is that you can only act within a specific legal framework and structure the recommendations on terms of stability and combating risk. But as long as we end up in the same position, I'll be quite happy. However, my question is how can you add a moral or indeed other pressure to implement the recommendation? For example, the Irish Finance Minister has indicated to a colleague of mine that not all insurers are implementing the recommendation, and would you support maybe a mechanism where those who aren't fully or efficiently implementing it should be maybe named and shamed? And I also want to bring to your attention the action of many insurers in my own country, and indeed some others elsewhere, I understand, in deciding not to pay out, and I repeat, not to pay out for business interruption payments due to COVID-19. In at least one case, it's now emerged that insurers specifically gave assurances to businesses that they were covered, but have now withdrawn that commitment, and some businesses are now taking legal action. And it would seem to me that the stability of the system is built on a few fundamental pillars, and one of them must be that when it counts, insurers will actually pay out. So how do you and the ESRB approach this consumer issue? And do you see the potential dangers of insurers simply adopting a very narrow or closed interpretation of what they will pay out for when times get difficult? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. As I alluded to, the recommendation that the ESRB has issued is broader, is intended to remove the stigma, is intended to restore a better level playing field amongst the various financial actors, and is longer term than other recommendations that have been issued by the EBA, by the ECB, or by many national authorities. Having said that, or by EIOPA indeed. Having said that, I am aware that some large insurance companies, because of their business model, because of their legal structure, because of the nature of their shareholdings, have decided nonetheless, and irrespective of the recommendations, to actually pay up dividends. Now, this is not in line with the recommendation. I'm also aware that some consumers of insurance products have decided to take legal action against insurance company. I'm also aware that some tribunals have actually decided that the refusal to insure against loss of operation revenues was not in line with the terms and conditions of the policy that was under review by the particular tribunal. So consumer protection tools are available. I'm pleased to see that consumers are using them. Courts are there to enforce consumer protections in the light of contractual terms that were issued. And, I think that this is how these tools should be properly used in order to, as I said, restore level playing fields, sensible and reasonable tools that can effectively guard against major risks that are likely to materialize. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we've reached the end of our public hearing on the ESRB. So I thank very much President Lagarde for this intense afternoon together, in which we had this opportunity to both discuss the monetary policies and the ESRB actions. So thanks again. I'm sure this is a time where it is very particular. It's always very important, but today is very particularly important to keep this dialogue and this relationship between the ECB and the Parliament. So thank you very, very much. So now I close the meeting, and I continue I close the hearing, but I continue the Econ meeting for the voting, because we have a voting session. Let me see. Okay. We continue with the vote on the amendments to the Econ report on the amending regulations number 575/2013 and 2019-876 as regards adjustments in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The rapporteur is Jonas Fernandez from SNB. The procedure we will follow today for this remote vote is based on the guidelines that were adopted by the Conference of Committee Chairs on the 8th of April. I will now inform you of today's voting procedure. Members and substitute members who are participating in the vote according to information received by the Secretariat have received an email from the